Hello everyone. I would like to specify that what will follow is a speculation based on the results of a personal investigation. Having said that, let's proceed to shed some light on one of the most mysterious events in game, the Night of the Black Knives. There are three main suspects who allegedly acted out the plan that led to the assassination of Godwyn. We will now explore their motives for committing such an act and the evidence their involvement. The first of which is Ranni the Witch, which in game events paint as the main culprit of the fact. And even though Ranni admits herself that she stole part of the Rune of Death and that she forged blades out of it through a fearsome rite, revealing that she did it all, we must take into account two very important pieces of evidence that underneath the involvement of someone else in the gruesome plan. The first being the remembrance of the Black Blade Malika that reads, Malika was a shadow-bound beast given to his Empyrean. Marika's sole need of her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death. Even then, she betrayed him. And the second one is the Black Knife armor. The assassins who carried out the deeds of the Night of the Black Knives were all women, who had close ties with Marika herself. Through these pieces of information, we can come to the conclusion that Ranni conspired with the kin of Marika to act out her plan. Throughout this story, we can also observe the end of a third plotter, Rykard, chief of the Inquisitors and brother to Ranni. As indicated by the blasphemous claw, which reads, a slab of rock engraved with traces of the Rune of Death can deflect the power of the Black Blade. On the night of the dire plot, Ranni rewarded Praetor Rykard with these traces. Should the coming trespass one day transpire, they would serve as a last resort foil, allowing Rykard to challenge Malika to the Black Blade, the Black Beast of destined death. Not much is known regarding Rykard during this period, other than his sadistic methods as an inquisitor in torturing his victims. From the info we can gather in-game, Rykard is completely against the Golden Order, being called in his later days the Lord of Blasphemy, and perhaps he harbored this feeling in his younger days, therefore taking the first opportunity to assist in the murder of Marika's firstborn himself, taking out a future enemy, or maybe his plan was to steal the Rune of Death from Malika with the gift granted by Ranni. Now, having spoken a little bit about this topic, I would like to apologize, for in truth, the Night of the Black Knives has a simpler explanation than the one we have been led to believe. However, in order to get these answers, we must leave all speculations at the door and rely only in in-game dialogues and descriptions, starting from the biggest truth, that Marika is in fact innocent. We have proof that the goddess has suffered for her child's death, and we also have to understand, if Marika were ever to harm her child, she could have done so by asking Malika, her shadow, to execute him via destined death. For Marika was not only a queen but a goddess, the highest power in the Golden Order. Her will is irrefutable, and if somebody were to question it, she could have justified her action by condemning the dragon cult her firstborn was so fond of, as its concept was so far removed from the Golden Order that she could have easily used it as evidence for her son's execution. Since the dragons were ancient creatures, considered almost heretical by the Order, for they came from an age before the Earth Tree, and Marika wanted that age to be forever lost to history, as shown by the lie which stated that Godfrey, her husband, was the first Elden Lord. As stated in the Remembrance of the Dragon Lord whose seat lies at the heart of the storm, beyond time, it is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Earth Tree. This is the truth that Marika hid herself. Another important point is that Godwyn died before the birth of his brothers, Morgott and Mog. This becomes really important later on in the video, I just wanted to state it right now. But returning back to the matter at hand, Rogier himself tells us so. Godwyn died during the peak of the Golden Order, that period being during Godfrey's reign.
The misshapen corpse under Stormvale. That is a sacred relic of the Black Knives plot, as that famed night of assassination is known. It happened during the golden age of the Erd Tree, long before the shattering of the Elden Ring. Someone stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade, and on a bitter night, murdered Godwyn the Golden. That was the first recorded death of a demigod in all history, and it became the catalyst. Soon, the Elden Ring was smashed, and thus sprang forth the war known as the Shattering.
Ranni, Rykard, and Radahn were conceived during this era, and although they weren't part of the royal line yet, they still held great power, which stemmed from their lineage, as Radagon was Marika's alter ego. Ranni was even chosen as an Empyrean and was gifted by her own two fingers, a shadow, Blight. We know this based on Blight's appearance, donning an armor that resembles the one of the Carrion Knights and sporting its signature blue. Another hint that Blight was given to Ranni during her childhood comes from Iji, and also from a cut dialogue during Renala's boss fight in which she refers to him as her child.
Blythe is Lady Ranni's stepbrother. Ranni's mother, Queen Renala, approved of him, and they played like siblings from childhood. They were always happy to have me tag along as well. When Lady Ranni renounced her flesh and chose the dark path of the Empyrean, Blythe and I swore allegiance as vassals. But none of us will ever forget our earliest days together. Promise to look after Blythe for me, will you? The man is honest to a fault. But fortunately, now he has you.
Lunar Princess Ranni's motivations are explicitly told by herself in-game. The reason why Ranni plotted the Night of the Black Knives would be to get out of the Two Fingers control, as stated when she speaks to us.
Let us speak of the past a while. I was once an Empyrean, of the demigods. Only I, Mikola, and Malenia could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own two fingers, as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age, which is when I received Blythe, in the form of a vassal tailored for an Empyrean. But I would not acquiesce to the Two Fingers. I stole the Rune of Death, slew mine own Empyrean flesh, casting it away. I would not be controlled by that thing. The Two Fingers and I have been cursing each other ever since, and the baleful shadows are their assassins.
It is also very likely that it was her childhood spent in Liurnia that drove Ranni to hate her fate as an Empyrean, and wanting to break free from her obligations, she began to develop her plan to rid herself of her own Empyrean body, which bound her by force to the greater will. However, Ranni did not simply want to die. She wanted to free her soul from her marked flesh, and this required a sacrifice, that being Godwyn the Golden. Most of the speculation that ties Marika to the Knight of the Black Knives comes from a group of assassins that Ranni decided to ally herself with, the Numen. We know for a fact that Marika was in the beginning a Numen as well, but this information is not told to us to prove that Marika had a hand in the plot. Instead, it explains why Ranni would have chosen the Numen to ally herself with. The Numen were shown as enemies of the Greater Will, and it makes sense that they would seek revenge against Marika, one of their own, who shirked them to become the goddess of the self-same will responsible for their downfall. The subject of the Omen will be amply explored in a future video. I just need to mention them right now. Anyways, getting back on track. We could also draw a connection between the leader of the assassins, Alecto, in Greek mythology. Alecto is the name of a Fury, sister to Tisiphone and Megara. Alecto's job as a Fury was castigating moral crimes such as wrath, sloth, and hubris of humans, especially if they were used against others. Her punishment for mortals was madness, and there was no other being in the entirety of the lands between whose arrogance rivaled that of Marika, the one who removed death to reign forever as an eternal. Through Godwyn's assassination, the Numen led by Alecto made sure that Marika would be driven mad with sorrow as punishment for her actions and those of the Greater Will. Having stolen the Rune of Death from Malekith, Princess Ranni infused the knives of the Numen with the power of death. Thus the assassins, aided by the cover of night and their concealing veils, breached the city. They accessed Godwyn's chambers where they proceed to murder him. The first demigod to die, or so it should have been. Unfortunately for Godwyn, his death was not complete. Only his soul would perish that night. Thus, he was destined to become a soulless husk. A fate worse than death, but why? For one simple reason. Ranni used one of the knives on herself during the murder of Godwyn, dying at the same time, interfering with the ritual. Curse Mark of Death reads, Curse Mark carved into the discarded flesh of Ranni the Witch, also known as the Half-Will Wound of the Centipede. This curse mark was carved at the moment of death of the first demigod, and should have taken the shape of a circle. However, two demigods perished at the same time, breaking the curse mark into two half-wheels. Ranni was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone. Having the description stated like this, it makes us understand that this is something that should not have been, thus betraying Alecto. For Godwyn was not really dead, and this wasn't the plan. And with his soul now gone, he became the first being to live in death. The Numen became the sole target of the Golden Order's ire, and Alecto's daughter herself, Tish, was the first to perish during the escape from the capital. We can also learn that after the deed, Marika buried her son at the feet of the Earth Tree. Being the only one in existence as a goddess and a queen who could authorize such an act, it was an harrowing gesture, possibly driven by the need to give him a proper burial worthy of a member of the Golden lineage. However, as if the deed hadn't been appalling enough, something awful happened that day. Let me pose you a question. What are the Omen? The game tells us that they are beings with horns growing out of them that resemble how men used to look like when the Earth Tree was still defined as the Crucible, before the removal of the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring and the rise of Marika as an Eternal. And that day, Marika made a dire mistake, for part of the Rune of Death still lingered within Godwyn's body, and after his burial, it began to seep back into the Earth Tree roots, forever tainting the Golden Order and bringing it closer to what it was during the Age of the Crucible. It is my belief that Marika learned of her mistake on the day that Mog and Morgott were born. The birth of the twins brought Marika close to madness, as it symbolized a mistake that never should have been made. This mistake was an indelible memory of Godwyn's death and Marika's own error. Through this event, we can understand the malice that the twins received from birth. Unfortunately, this mistake had far-reaching consequences that brought about the end of the Age of Plenty. Part of the Rune of Death was involuntarily inserted within the Earth Tree, and as a result, humans, animals, and vegetation were all affected by decay. As the Blessed Yew Talisman states, it was once believed that the blessed sap of the Earth Tree would drip from the boughs forever, but at the Age of Plenty came to a close, and with time, the Earth Tree became more of an object of faith. How could this be possible, though? My theory is, when part of the Rune of Death was absorbed by the Earth Tree, it reintroduced a concept of entropy into the lands between. This resulted in an endless aging process without death, an error that Roger aptly described. This explanation could also account for the state of the tree and the inhabitants of the lands between. Upon arrival in the lands between, we can observe that the finger readers, humans, and even some of the demigods appear to be in a state of advanced aging. The prolonged aging process could be attributed to the fact that only a small portion of destined depth was responsible for infecting the tree, as it was located within Godwyn's burial site. The Rune of Death is the cog that governs the entirety of aging, decay, and death within the Elden Ring. When only a small part of the rune is inserted within the Earth Tree, it is only natural to assume that aging decay would take much longer than usual, as the process was based on the entirety of the Rune of Death and not just a small fraction, bending the rules of the world in a twisted way. With only traces of death and not the full element, the natural laws spiral out of control, and it led to an eternal aging for some living beings without ever arriving at the final door of death. Since the concept of death is missing the rest of the rune, we must retrieve what remains of it in-game in order to restore death to its original state. This is demonstrated by Enya's death within Round Table Old, which becomes only possible after the restoration of the complete Rune of Death. So this is it for this video. I'm so happy that I managed to finish the second part. Next time will probably be the final and the third part regarding this entire series regarding Godwyn, which we will explore what happened after Godwyn was buried under the Earth Tree, and what happened also to Marika and how I think it led to the entirety of the Shattering. I would just like to say that I didn't expect the support regarding the Godwyn series. While I was working at this one, I saw the views, the likes on the first one, and it makes me so happy that you guys liked that one. Anyways, this is it for it. I'll promise I release the third part way sooner than I did with the second part. I was just like a little bit busy with exams and studying, so I couldn't afford spending too much time on producing and doing this video. But now that I'm done with the exams, I can get back to work a little bit faster on the videos. Anyways, enough of me rambling. I would like to thank you, all of you, again, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao!
This is farewell, my dear. Tell Blythe and Iji I love them.